I'm here to talk to you about assessment and evaluation. And I will tell you that these will be a huge part of your teaching. Once you move into teaching, you will spend an inordinate amount of time worrying about assessments and evaluations and putting them together and analyzing the data and researching what is best. And so I don't know, do you have a course at the university that teaches much about assessment? Good. So you've already had a pretty good tip of the iceberg, if you will, and gotten your feet under you with this. My main purpose today is to give you some friendly but firm absolutes about assessment and evaluation. So as we go through this, a couple times I'm going to say, if you don't remember anything else, remember this. And I will probably say that about 3 times. And those will be the 3 big ideas that I want you to get from this afternoon that I think are really critical. So as we look at assessment and evaluation, are they the same thing? Are they different? If they're different, how are they different? Just popcorn out what you think. When you see them, do you use them interchangeably? Or do they have a big difference in your mind? They are a lot alike, they are interchangeable, but there are a lot of differences. In the world of K through 12 education, we kind of do differentiate them a little bit in terms of, we often think of assessment as the device, the event, the tool. The actual act of the test is typically the assessment. So we have the Kansas State assessment. That's an actual test. We have a formative assessment. That's a specific assessment that we have put together to gain specific information. So when we talk about assessment, it's usually we're talking about one particular test or purpose that we have for testing someone. When we think of evaluation in the K through 12 world, we're really typically looking more broadly. We're usually looking at trying to assess a lot of things about a program or a lot of things about a student. So an evaluation may have multiple assessments within it because we're trying to get a bigger picture of a kiddo or a bigger picture of a program. And so just as you move into that K through 12, or your world's probably going to look more like K through 6 or K through 8 or something like that. That's usually how we differentiate those 2 terms. If we're looking at wanting to get a student into a special program for services, we will normally talk about that student's evaluation. And there will be a lot of different assessments that will go into that. So let's talk a little bit about the reasons that we do assessment. So here's one of the first big ideas, okay? If you don't get anything out of this today, remember this. And this is going to show up 2 or 3 times as we're talking. Never give an assessment unless you have a specific purpose in mind. Don't waste your time. Do not waste a student's time. Have a very clear purpose in mind before you give an assessment. And you know, that is one of those comments, as I've said this so many times, it sounds like no duh. No duh. Why would I take the time to give a test if I didn't have a reason? But teachers do it all the time. They do it just because it's expected. They do it because it's at the end of a chapter or the end of a unit, at the end of a book, or because another teacher did it and gave it to them. But if you are not going to review the results from that assessment and make decisions, either decisions on your instruction or decisions for that child's program or decisions on what you're going to use to teach next, if you're not going to actually use the data you will get from an assessment, then don't waste your time giving it. If you have a good idea at the end of a unit on how the students are progressing, you don't have to give an assessment just to find out how they're doing if you already know. Only give that test, grade that test, and take a score on that test if you're going to use the results from it. So Why do we give? That was, you kind of got that ahead of time. It's going to come up. But one of the reasons I hammered on that so much right now is we have 23 new teachers in our building this year. Somebody please go, whoa, because that's a lot, okay? And I'm really feeling like it. 23 new teachers in our building just this year. Most buildings don't have 23 teachers. We have 23 just new teachers. And I'm seeing that happen a lot in those classrooms. I'm seeing a lot of them giving a lot of assessments that they're not really using. They're not really using the data. And your time is so precious in those classrooms. You never have enough time with those kids to get where you need to get. So I'm really mindful of don't give it unless you're going to use it. So why do we give assessments? Normally at this point, I have you all start sharing out why you think we give assessments. But some groups are real participatory and some are a little quieter. And right now you're a little bit quieter. So until we get you feeling comfortable with participating, we'll give you some of this. Why do we give assessments? One of the main reasons that we do in a K through 5 program or in a K through 12 program is we're looking for that alignment. And that alignment is critical. It's everything. Is what we're teaching matched up with what we're supposed to be teaching, which are our standards, and is what we're using to teach those standards all in line. So we're looking for that alignment all the way across. Is it matched up with the standards, with the materials, and with the content that we're supposed to be teaching? So that's our primary reason. And then we have 2 secondary reasons. One is if we have that alignment, if we're teaching what we're supposed to be teaching, and we're using the appropriate materials to teach what we're supposed to be using, then how are the kids doing with it? How are the kids performing with what we have said is the intended curriculum of what we're going to teach? And then, although they call this a secondary reason, this is probably one of the more critical ones. You're giving the kids tests to assess your teaching. Every time you give kids an assessment, what you're really assessing is how well did you teach. Because the bottom line of everything, guys, is if your kids aren't learning, you're not teaching. You may be up there in front of them every day, and it may feel like teaching, but if they're not learning, it's not teaching. So a critical reason that we give assessments is to find out, are we doing our job? Or what we told someone we were going to do, are we actually getting it done and doing it? So let's talk about, and I could tell just by some of the answers that you gave that you have had a little bit more work with assessments than maybe some of the groups have in the past. So we'll kind of cruise through these. But there's lots of different assessments, and one of the main reasons that we talk about this is as educators, we're notorious for buzzwords and phrases and comments that unless you live in this world of education, you don't really have a good definition for. So we want to put some definition to them. And these are pretty standard. Formative assessments. You've heard that all the time. But a formative assessment, it is an assessment that we give throughout the delivery of content to determine if we're on track. It's one that gives us very timely feedback that says, if we keep on this road, we're going to ultimately get to this standard, and we're going to have this standard mastered or covered. And it tells us how well the kids are doing on their way there. So it's typically throughout the course of the year. So most often, we would at least give a formative assessment once every quarter. But a formative assessment once every 3 weeks, once every 4 weeks could be done. Pre-assessment, just what it says it is that test that you give before you deliver the curriculum that you're going to deliver. This is an area that new teachers often overlook, and that is the importance of a pre-assessment. New teachers often just delve right into their content, right into their curriculum, without assessing the kids where they are at before you start. So what you're doing is you're taking a group of people and you're assuming a place that they all are and that you can take off with your instruction. When the reality is, especially with an area as mobile as our community is and kids moving in and out, you really need to get a handle on what your kids already know before you just start in with the content. And I remember several years ago when Ware first got really started with pre-assessments, our teachers were shocked with their first quarter pre-assessment. They were spending a whole first quarter on review of what kids really already knew. When if they had given those pre-assessments and found that out, they still would have done the review because they've been at home all summer. They needed a little bit refresher, but they probably would have taken that 9 weeks of instruction and pushed it into 2 or maybe 3 weeks of instruction and then gone on, because the kids really had all of the concepts. So it's really important before you move into a unit to do a pre-assessment. And it is very appropriate that your pre-assessment is the same as your post-assessment. They ought to be the same, because the post-assessment is ultimately what you want the kids to know at the end of this unit. Well, if you give them the very test at the beginning of the unit and they can already master 80% or more, that should significantly change what you're going to teach for that quarter. So very, very important to do your pre-assessments. Progress monitoring. How many of you in your student teaching experience have talked much about progress monitoring? But progress monitoring is checking for learning frequently. Teachers do it, but they don't talk about the fact that they do it. How many of your classrooms have exit slips? You do exit slips. See, there's all kinds of hands right there. Well, an exit slip is progress monitoring. Progress monitoring is frequent assessment of what you're teaching. Short, quick, down and dirty, little, I always called it dipsticks, sticking the dipstick in the oil and just seeing where you're at, making sure that you're moving in a forward manner. Very, very important. Progress monitoring started with our ESS students, our special needs students. We started doing it there because what we learned was with our challenging learners, it was very difficult for them to learn a lot of content over an extended period of time and hang on to that content. So what we started doing is we would teach, then test and see if they got it. And then teach, and then test, and teach, and test. Well, what we found out is that worked really, really well for our ESS kids. And our ESS kids were making lots of progress doing it that way. Learning and then showing what they learned. Learning, showing what they learned. Well, then we had a brainstorm. If that works so well with ESS kids, that may work with any kid who's struggling. And so that is why we do it. We use progress monitoring, especially for our kids that are in our multi-tiered system of support programs. Any kids that are needing a little bit of extra boost, we progress monitor so that we can make sure they're staying on the right track. But long, long gone are the days of us taking kids who aren't learning, putting them in tutoring for a whole quarter, only to test at the end of the quarter and find out that the tutoring didn't work. What the progress monitoring is for, as much as it is to see if the kids are progressing, is to see if what you are doing with the kids is working. Because teachers are notorious for taking kids who aren't learning like the rest of the class and just giving it to them individually or the exact same thing over again, and then being very surprised when you gave it to them twice and they still didn't learn. And the reality is they didn't learn it that way the first time, so they may not learn it that way the second, third, or fourth time. So if you're progress monitoring, you will see that, and you will see that they need that concept taught in a different way. They need the reading broken down even into smaller increments or whatever the concept may be. I remember when we first started doing this, was in reading, and we would, every time we would progress monitor with our kids in the MITS, we call multi-tiered system of support MITS. So if I say that, that's what I'm talking about. we would all get together after assessing our first MITS kids, and they wouldn't be making any more progress with these small groups. And that's when we started learning things like, we're working with them on decoding and they have a fluency problem. Well, we need to be working on the kids with the fluency problem with fluency techniques. But that's another thing that progress monitoring helps demonstrate to you, is what is the isolated skill that you need to work with that kiddo on. So then we move into summative assessments. Summative assessments are exactly what they say. It's that da-da, the end of the whatever. It's that unit test. It's that Kansas State assessment. The way you need to look at summative assessments is summative assessments come when you can't do a whole lot about whatever the results are, and except for maybe next year's person. And so that's the reason all of these other assessments are so critical, because you don't want to give just a summative assessment. Once you take the Kansas State test, you can't change the results. They are what they are, and they're going to follow a kid. So you want to be doing all of these other things, formative assessments and progress monitoring, up to that point while you still have an opportunity to intervene and do something about how the kiddo is going to be performing. Still very useful. We need those scores. Those scores tell us a whole lot about your teaching. Did you get the kids where you were supposed to get them? Your kids' state assessment scores are just as much a reflection over what you've done as they are with what the kid has done. Criterion reference test, we don't use those as much, although I am seeing a trend of revisiting those now with the college and career readiness standards. Criterion reference is when you take a narrow view of the curriculum and you assess just the mastery in that narrow view. So you would have just a whole bunch of questions on regrouping and math and get just a score on regrouping and see how the kids were doing with that. And I kind of seeing now our curriculum used to be very wide and we've narrowed it up, and I see us maybe going back to some of those more narrowly viewed assessments. Standardized norm reference testing. These are those tests that they use, California Achievement Test, Iowa Test of Basic Skills. These are the tests that are typically national assessments that they use to compare students to other large groups of students on a subset of skills. So your ACT tests that you took to get into college, those sort of tests, they were comparing you to a large group of students on how you did on certain skills. Then we have our state assessments that are linked to our state standards and are to be linked to our intended curriculum. Right now our intended curriculum is the college and career readiness standards, and state assessments are to be linked to those, although right now we're in transition. This year's test will be our first Kansas State assessments that's supposed to be embodying all of the new college and career readiness standards. Last year we took one that was half old standards and half new standards, and now we're supposed to be rolling over into all new standards, so we're all in limbo land. Diagnostic, very, very important types of assessments. They are tests that are to allow a teacher to know very specifically what a skill a student can do or cannot do. Can any of you give me a name of a diagnostic test? How many of you have been familiar with DIBELS? Okay. DIBELS is very much, yes, it is. STAR test. DIBELS definitely gives a real isolated type of a skill to diagnose what you need to work on. One of the things we use DIBELS for is to determine, do we need to work on phonemic awareness? Do we need to work on decoding? Do we need to work on fluency? Helps us determine, break down those components of reading and know exactly which one we need to work on. And now we have a brand new terminology, and that is multidisciplinary performance task, the MDPT, which does not just roll off of your tongue very easily. You kind of have to stop, reflect, and say MDPT. So I think it's going to end up getting called something that educators can say quicker than MDPT, unless you can say it quicker. And MDPT is the new part of the Kansas State Assessment Test that all of our students are going to be taking this year, and it is the performance section of the state assessments. And it has been designed not to just know the content, but to demonstrate or to show what you can do with that content. So students will be asked to perform a task, hence the T, task. They will have a task to do that they will have to integrate a lot of different kinds of learning into this task and demonstrate that they could do this. Teachers are really rattled about this and act like it's all brand new. And it is new to most educators now, but we've actually come full circle for those of us that have a lot of gray and some age to us. When the Kansas State Assessments first started, we had a performance section on the Kansas State Assessments. And that's exactly what this is. I will tell you that one of the, when I was teaching, one of the performance tests on the state assessments was in 4th grade. In math, students had to build a doghouse on paper. They had to build a doghouse. So they had to talk about all the lumber that they would need and all the measurements of all of the lumber that they would need. They had to know some science, some physics on how to put this thing together and for it to be structurally sound and stay together. So you were looking at all of those components for them to put into this test. It was a very challenging performance task on there. Why do you think we got away from doing that? What would be a reason we got away from? It was a good thing to see if kids could do. Why did we abandon it? Some of them didn't have experience. So then what teachers did is they knew something like that was going to be on the test. So they would spend the year talking about building birdhouses, because you couldn't talk about building a doghouse because that would be exactly what was going to be on the test. And you can't exactly teach to the test, so we all taught how to build birdhouses. So we kind of corrected that. What would be another reason?
It's hard to grade or like assess.
Absolutely. Very difficult to score. Very, very difficult to score. Very expensive to score because you really need at least 3 eyes on each answer, scoring it by a rubric, and then comparing the scores. So you take the, I don't know how many kids are in Kansas. I've lost that number over the years.
And then
but
they pick every 10.
Right. It just was so costly. You had to pay all of those people to score that test. You had to find people that wanted to work in the summer to score that test. And you had to find a way to do it fairly because kids were all over the place with their answers. So it just became so cumbersome and so expensive that they abandoned the performance part of the test. But we're back at it. We're going to give it another round. They've already asked for volunteers for the summer. And they've put some perimeters over how many years you have to have been teaching and what you've had to teach and all of that. And they're going to find some people, try to bring them together. And here's the kicker. They want them to volunteer. So they're asking for all of these educators to come together this summer and volunteer their time to assess these MDPTs that the kids are going to do. So this will be very interesting to see how long the MDPTs stay a part of the Kansas State Assessments.
Like the lemonade stand one also?
Yes, it was. Building a lemonade stand, that's right.
And they had to predict their profit and what would they have to charge in order to make a profit on their lemonade.
That's exactly right. When I was teaching 3rd and 4th grade, when the state math test first started, it started at 3rd grade, and I tell the group every year, so some of you have probably always heard this, but I'll never forget that. One of the questions on the test, and it was actually one of the performance, there was more than one performance. There were several performance questions, but one of them on the test was, how would you find out how many hairs are on your head? How would you go about finding out how many hairs are on your head, and to explain this and then give a reasonable answer for how many hairs were on your head. Third grade, math performance question. So what I had in my third grade room were a whole bunch of kids staring at the back of the hair behind them, and some of them were actually girls were grabbing their own hair and going, counting. I mean, it was a nightmare. But anyway, they didn't do so well. So why do we assess our kiddos? We've talked about some of this, but it's really, really important. As I said before, if you're not going to use the assessments, don't do them. So know why you're giving these assessments. We do it so a teacher can know what students know or don't know, which is called diagnostic. Can they do it or can they not do it? We do it for formative reasons, to provide information on the delivered curriculum, and allows us, here's the most important part of that, allows us to make changes. One of the things as you start your careers next year, every time you give a test, you need to think about, what am I going to change the next time I teach? What am I going to do differently? And if you can't answer that, then you didn't have a really good reason for giving that test. Because if you're just going to continue doing things the way you have been, you didn't learn anything from that assessment. So always think about how the kids do, and then think about, what can I do differently to get a better result the next time? And then summative, which again is just that measure at a certain time that evaluates a person, one individual, on what they know at that given time with that given curriculum. But the most important is to drive decisions on revising your curriculum, either the actual curriculum or the implementation of the curriculum, scheduling, grouping, how you put kids in their groups, how we staff, who needs more assistance, that sort of thing, and where we put our resources. These reasons down here drive decisions. When you give assessments, especially formative assessments, you're looking to answer all of those things in your classroom. But your administrators are also looking at all of your results to answer all of those questions. If kids aren't doing well, and we look at those every quarter, the formative assessment results in a big meeting with everyone, we look at all of that and we say, if kids aren't doing very well, then these are all the things we need to look at. Do we have the right curriculum? Is it implemented with integrity and validity? Are our schedules right? And just to give you an example, years and years ago when I got to Ware, their schedules, every grade level schedule was so fragmented that they didn't have any long periods of time of instruction. So one of the first things we did is we went to a blocked schedule so that teachers would have long, uninterrupted times of instruction. Because what we saw is we'd have a second grade classroom, they'd come in for 40 minutes and then they'd head to PE. And then they'd come back for 40 minutes and they'd head to music. Then they'd come back for 30 minutes and they'd head to music. And they were just constantly coming and going. And every time your kids are in transition, you are losing instructional time. That is something for you to think about also. Because one of the things teachers love to do, and I did this when I was teaching at Sheridan School, and I loved it. We departmentalized, is what they called it back then. I taught all of the math and the science, and the other teacher taught all of the reading and the social studies, and that is so cool because all I had to focus on were a few curriculum areas and I could really become a specialized. But that shuffling kids back and forth, the year we stopped doing that, all of our scores went up because we weren't shuffling kids back and forth as often. And all of those transitions, elementary kids just do not do that well with a lot of transitions. Now with SFA, it's embedded within there and it's important enough to get them within their groups. But the least transitions you can have in elementary school, the better. We do it to determine the success, the individual kiddo's success, your instructional success, the curriculum success, the program success, comparative success. How well is Ware doing compared to Lincoln, compared to Morris Hill? And then qualification. Based upon how this kid is performing, do they qualify for a MITS group? Do they qualify for ESS? Do they qualify for ELL? Do they qualify for any of our special programs? Also, accountability. We are in the world of accountability. It's very, very important that we can answer to our parents how their kids are doing, and we often only know how they are doing through assessments. And our district and our state, they need to know what schools are successful, what individual teachers are successful. And all of that comes through assessment. That is the way the world determines whether we are successful or not. Right or wrong, that's it. Assessments tell the world whether we are doing what we are supposed to be doing. So, once you decide to give an assessment, make sure all of these things are in place. And again, these are going to seem like those no-duh things again, but you will be surprised how often we don't quite get this right. Have a very clear purpose. Spelling test. What's your purpose in spelling test? You just need to know if they can spell that word on that day correctly? What's that really going to tell you down the road? If they're not using it in their writing and using that word correctly, then what is them knowing how to spell that word on that day, but not within content of a sentence doing for us? A lot of time wasted on spelling. The research will tell you that giving isolated spelling tests does not teach kids to be good spellers. I spent a lot of time getting 100 on spelling tests, and I still can't spell. Worth the time and effort. Again, we've kind of already talked about that. Connected to the standards. Performance levels. Let's talk there a minute, because that's something that's really confusing to a lot of people. When you give an assessment, you need to have your own rubric, hopefully written down, but at least in your head, of where the appropriate scores will fall. What is acceptable in your room, and what categories does that put a kiddo in? At Ware, we have performance levels for all of our formative assessments, and we use the same terminology that they use on the state assessments. So every time we give a formative assessment, our teacher can tell you, these group of scores are in exemplary, this group of scores is in advanced, needs improvement, whatever your categories are. It's really important for you to get a picture on where your class is falling, and those are called performance levels. You have to use the data. We're going to talk about that a little bit more, and you have to do it often enough that you can do something about it. So, you can't fight what you can't see. Another reason assessment is important. You can't just keep teaching and teaching and teaching and assuming they're getting it. The assessment is what is telling you whether they are getting it or not. It will make that data visible to you. Data is truth. Whether it's pretty or whether it's ugly, it's your truth. And assumptions are not truths. Assumptions and gut feelings are just that. They're gut feelings, and you think. But your data puts the truth to it. And you have to have the assessment to put the truth to your picture. And there's nothing worse than believing your kids are doing really, really well, and then sending them all out to take their SRIs and find out they're not reading. That's not a good feeling. So that's another reason for that progress monitoring along the way, so you don't get shell-shocked with those low SRIs. It discloses your strengths, it discloses your weaknesses, so you have to be brave, you have to be willing to share. Data analysis. I think all of you by this point have been in some sort of a focus meeting, either a team meeting or a focus meeting. Every building calls them something different, but it's where everybody at that grade level gets together and you throw all your data out there and you look at how the kids are doing. Critical to your success. If you're the only one that ever looks at your scores, you'll never grow, because you'll just have the same old ideas about what they are all the time, and you're not comparing them to how the other kids are doing at that grade level. So you really have to look at your performance in regards to the performance of all the kids at that grade level, and even better if you have data outside of just your building to throw them all in there. I would be a huge proponent of going to learning labs and everybody throwing their SRIs out there for everyone to see, and then talking about how's this building getting SRIs like that, and why aren't we helping this building over here that's got lower SRIs? Well, we would all improve if we were all sharing of our ideas and concepts and giving our resources to the places that need it the most. And that's what data analysis does for you. You have to collect your data frequently and analyze it frequently for effectiveness. If you are giving your own test in your own classroom, you need to be bouncing that test off of another teacher and letting them give you feedback. If you are always making your own little assessments, your own little progress monitoring, that's probably not real healthy, especially when you're starting out at the beginning, because you really aren't test experts at this point. And you really won't become test experts until you've done it for many, many years. I never became a test expert, and I'm still not. I would say I've got some in the building who are, just because they've been teaching for many, many years, and they've learned through their errors. But you always need to share those assessments with others and have them give them to their kids and then share. You know, one of the more difficult content areas to assess is writing. Everybody struggles a little bit with whatever they're using, the 4-step or the 6 trait, whatever they're using. It's hard to assess writing. Writing is something that really needs to be a group effort. You need to have a rubric, you assess it, and then you need to get that writing in the hands of at least 2 other people to look at. If you're the only one that ever analyzes the writing in your class, you're giving your kids a really narrow view. You really need to get that on another set of eyes. Talk about this real quick, teaching to the test. This is one of those things that always comes up at summer picnics and Christmas family gatherings, that those horrible teachers out there, all they do is teach to the test to get the results. And so if you ever get caught up in that, what you do is you look them square in the eye and you say, heck yes, I teach to the test. Why would I not teach them what they're going to be tested on? That's what teaching to the test is. You don't teach kids to roller skate and then give them a test on snow skiing. That makes no sense. You teach them what you're going to be testing them on. So if you are a good teacher, you are teaching what you are going to test. Don't be afraid to give them the exact same test that you're going to assess them with at the beginning, back to the pre and post test. I hear people say, oh my gosh, they'll memorize all the questions on the test in a 9-week period. You could never be so fortunate in your entire life that a kid would ever remember something on a test 9 weeks ago. And if they remember it and they remember what the answer was, they just learned something. Hallelujah. They remembered something that you taught them 9 weeks ago. That would be the best thing in the world that could happen. Don't ever worry about teaching to the test. Now, would we take a Kansas State assessment and break the questions down into so many this week, so many that week, and so many this week? No. But would they be similar questions? Absolutely. It's fine to teach kids what you're going to be testing them over. That really is what you should be doing. You shouldn't be teaching them things you're not going to test. That's a waste of everybody's time. This is what that test is going to look like this year, just in case you were curious. Kids are going to read 2 to 3 short text. They're going to be 750 words in each one of them, looking for third graders to crash and burn on the first one. Then they're going to have guiding questions, and then the next day, they'll do all of that in one day, and then the next day, they'll have a writing prompt, and they'll write about what they read about. Okay, here's those levels of performance I was talking about. This is kind of what it looks like. This is just one example. But you need to have your kids in those levels. You need to do that as a grade level. And then every assessment that you give, you should be able to plug into those grade levels so that overall you're looking for all of your kids to be at meet standards or above so that you can see your percentages. If you've got more than 15% in the last two categories, you have got to seriously look at your instruction. Sharing your testing results of your kids will be very, very intimidating the first few times you do it. You'll be embarrassed, nervous, worried, but do it immediately. First time when you land that job, you get your first set of results, run as fast as you can to the classroom next door that's teaching the same thing and say, this is what my kids did, what'd yours do? Share it, talk about it, be open, be honest. That's how you'll grow. That's how you'll get better and better. Okay, done. What kind of questions do you guys have?
The PT is given, that'll give us more.
I think so too.
Highlights too on what we
I do too.
focus on.
I threw it in to last fall was the first, well, it's the first time we heard of it. I threw it in last fall, and I do want to expand on that part of it because I think your worlds are going to change a lot if they find this to be doable. Your worlds are going to change a lot and it won't be just third, fourth, and fifth grade. We're going to have to start this project learning and these performance tasks. We're going to have to be doing those at kindergarten, first, and second to get them anywhere near ready to do that at third grade. Because this year I really expect the third graders to just...
Didn't they already give, there's a caveat, they're looking at that to see if they're even...
Yeah, I don't even know if the third graders will be ready to do this. I mean, just the 750 word passage all at once for a third grader is, I mean, they're just going to look at that, some of them, and stop right there.
Is this just one event, or is there another plan in other content areas like science or?
Their concept is to expand. Yeah,
But
that they're
this will
just
be one performance piece per child this year.
Yes.
But next year it might be for the science.
yes, and yes, that is correct.
I think one of the most important things that you talked about is just having a purpose for giving an assessment. Because I remember as a new teacher, I'd give the pretest, and then a week later on the weekend, I'd be grading the pretest, but I had already started my unit. And I just didn't have the concept of why I knew
The
I
order,
could
yeah.
give it, but looking at it, and what does that tell you, and how do you change, and what are you going to do now?
Well, and the thing that you guys are going to learn, and I don't mean this critical in any way, shape, or form, but you're going to do things when you start teaching that the other teachers are doing. You're just going to follow what they're doing because as good as you believe you are right now, you're going to start next year and you're going to really think you have everything under control and you know exactly what you're doing, and then the kids are going to show up. And after the kids show up, all of a sudden you're going to feel like you have no idea what you're doing, why anyone even believed that you could do this or even entrusted you to be in a classroom, and you're going to panic because you're not going to know, I promise you, you're not going to know what you're doing. And so when you find that out, the thing that you go do is you go find out what teachers who've been doing it for a while are doing, and you just copy what they're doing. We all did. I mean, we'd be lying if we said we didn't. We just did what other people were doing because we assumed that was right. Well, not all teachers do it this way. Not all teachers pre-test. Not all teachers progress monitor. You hope that you end up being a partner with somebody that does, but sometimes bad practices can get permeated from modeling bad practices. And they're not intentional bad practices. They're the way that person was taught when they started copying somebody else. So you just need to know these things so that you can break out of some of those molds and give kids.
That's a reasonable, logical question because that makes people think sometimes, should we change this?
Right.
Is there a rationale for it?
You know.
Spelling tests.
Yeah.
I know that some of them are thinking, we do a spelling test.
Yep. Yeah, we do.
Basically, you just do it for the parents.
You do. That's the only reason you give a spelling test, because the research has proven over and over and over that kids do not learn how to spell giving spelling tests. Kids learn how to spell using words in context of their writing over and over again. But those lists that they memorize are typically gone 2 weeks. 2 weeks out from the spelling test. They're not going to remember those words. So it's not, for the amount of time that some spend putting spelling words in crossword puzzles and word searches and all of the other things, they're not, yeah, they're not going to memorize those words. Well, I wish you all the best in your student teaching experiences. This is a very, very exciting time of your life. This only happens once, hopefully. You only student teach once, and then you graduate. So, embrace it. You will, for the rest of your teaching lives, you will start sentences with, when I was student teaching, and all these things that you're experiencing right now will become part of your history and part of your story. So really embrace it, enjoy it, but work really, really hard. Work really hard and learn all that you can learn and get it right while you're student teaching. That will help you so much after that first assignment. Don't just go through the motions. You can get through student teaching by just going through the motions, but you won't benefit in the long run by doing that. Ask the questions. Why are we doing this? What's the purpose of this? Come up with ideas to do it differently and see if they will embrace those. But wish you all the luck and wish you lots of luck with those first interviews. Okay, thank you.